coffee, tea, and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, take our leave and go. At a fair in a sunny town, her hair was blonde and this was around. She was made a whaler man come around.
Well, I'm out here in this small creek doing some testing on a few modifications to the skiff. Things were going well, and then suddenly something felt very off. Let's see if we can figure out what happened. Well, that doesn't seem quite right. Turns out I had made two mistakes in the construction of the new rudder. I had made the new blade a little bit too long, and I had also set the rudder using the downhaul so that it was vertical in the water, and that led to a condition where there was a lot of force on the rudder unnecessarily. I've since discovered that the rudder can be set almost horizontal in the water, almost all the way up as it pivots, and that's a lot easier on the plywood, but it still is perfectly sufficient to steer the boat. You still have plenty of steering authority. The new blade is 3/8 plywood, and personally I expected that it would be plenty strong for this application. I've used this method for smaller boats, but apparently that was just a little bit too much force of water with the rudder set all the way down and vertical. Maybe there was a defect in the plywood. I really don't think so. And maybe I'd actually struck something at an odd angle underwater, but I didn't feel it, so I don't think that's what happened. But I can kind of see how this could occur, as there's nothing really bracing the blade except for the pivot bolt. That's the only thing holding it. I've since decided to ditch the downhaul, and I just use the tension between the pivot bolt and nut to set the rudder's angle, and I set it at a much shallower angle. After the new rudder had failed spectacularly, it seemed that the day's sailing would be at an end. Then I remembered that just below the hole for the pivot bolt, I had actually drilled a second hole for a locking pin, and it was slightly smaller, 1/4 inch rather than 3/8, but I figured that would probably work just fine to reset the pivot bolt and get me through the rest of the day and get to enjoy a little bit of sailing and continue the testing on the new jib. I made sure to set this improvised rudder blade at a very shallow angle. The improvised blade worked surprisingly well for the rest of the day's sailing, and I really couldn't even tell that anything was wrong. The original centerboard was made from 2-inch stock, so it's a big heavy chunk of wood. I planed a bit of a leading edge and trailing edge shape onto the board, but it was still very thick in profile, so I felt that this was definitely creating some drag. The other disadvantage is that wood floats, which means that I would have to have some way of forcing the board to stay down, which almost defeats the purpose of it, because the major advantage of a centerboard is that it can swing up into the trunk if you happen to strike the bottom or an underwater obstacle. So I've been using a notched stick to keep the board down, and it had multiple notches that I could use to adjust the height. Well, I happen to have an old dagger board from a dinghy that I no longer have that is very similar in width and length to my current centerboard, and it fits the trunk very nicely. So I'm going to convert this dagger board to a centerboard by simply drilling a pivot hole. It has a very nice foil shape to it, and it's very thin, so should have minimal drag. And this is going to allow me to totally cap off the top of the trunk, making the cockpit or the interior of the boat much more watertight, because I had to have a large opening for that stick, which meant that water would often slosh up through the trunk, which is pretty annoying. So now I have an aluminum board which can be lowered based on the weight of the board using gravity, and I have an outhaul line that's used to raise it. This combination of improved rudder and centerboard function will make the boat much more capable in shallow water.
Ooh, I got this thing out of the water.